I don't just talk about other people's stuff, I also make my own. Books in particular. To date, I have 4 books you can check out on Amazon. Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and the short story collection Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Hop on down to the description for Amazon links to all 4 books. Enjoy whichever ones you read, and enjoy the video.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am the Omni viewer, and I'm back to do just one more of these unscripted videos about Jurassic World, scientific accuracy, feathered dinosaurs, and cinematic design. Just one more. After this, I'm going to just call it quits on this particular aspect and move on to the other projects I've got to get done. And hopefully, this last little bit will clarify things as best as I can. I've actually noticed a few things mentioned here and there that I would like to address because people are asking certain questions about what I've been saying, and I do want to address some of them. So, the big question, of course, is that I said in the last video that the designs for things like the Jurassic Park T-Rex or the Jurassic Park velociraptor are cinematic, just as they are. But some people have said that even if they understand what I was driving at overall, I didn't necessarily explain why feathers are not cinematic. And there are actually plenty of people who are saying that feathers indeed can be cinematic. So in defense of the idea that feathered dinosaurs can indeed be cinematic, a lot of people point to the pyroraptor, which is making its debut in Jurassic World Dominion, and how it is a feathered variety of the dromaeosaurid species. Not species, classification. Sorry I misspoke there. But anyway, they point to that as the example of how a feathered dinosaur can look cinematic. And of course there's always that old statement of how you say that feathered dinosaurs just look like big chickens or birds, but have you seen such and such a paleo artist who makes the feathered dinosaurs look terrifying? Well, let's really look at that. So this is what the pyroraptor looks like, as you can see. Based on the trailers, this is taken straight from the trailer, this is what the pyroraptor looks like. And yes, it does have feathers all over it. Look at really how those feathers are, though. Really long feathers on the arms, almost trailing behind it. Feathers that really stick up on the head. These are very prominent feathers. They almost, in fact, look like plumage in a lot of ways. This is a very tropical bird-inspired version of the pyroraptor. Curiously, though, when I looked up what actual pyroraptors are theorized to look like, and I had to sift through a lot of Dominion-inspired renderings of the movie Pyroraptor in order to find this, but this is the model I found that is a scientifically accurate pyroraptor. You'll note how different the feathers are here. Let's put them side by side so you can really get an idea. Note how on the scientifically accurate pyroraptor, the feathers are a bit more downy, except on the arms, but they're not even as long on the arms. They're more smooth, nothing's really sticking out. Why, it's almost as if the pyroraptor's design for the movie was altered in a lot of ways to look more cinematic and, dare I say, intimidating for the film. In fact, the pyroraptor's feather design looks more reminiscent of the atrociraptor's feather design when you look at that scientifically accurate model, at least as far as we know. And yet, the atrociraptor is also in Jurassic World Dominion, and it looks like this. Scaly skin with not a feather to be seen. Odd that I don't see anyone really talking about that, though. Maybe atrociraptors don't count, who knows? All I know is that even with the feathers being added to something like the pyroraptor, liberties were still taken in order to make it look more monstrous, if you will. And in fact, it really is just a Jurassic Park velociraptor with feathers. Let's put those two side by side again, the scientifically accurate one and the cinematic one. Notice how the science-y pyroraptor has more bird-like features on its head, whereas the movie pyroraptor has a more reptilian head. I'll be coming back to that in just a moment, but I would also like to say first and foremost that while I will admit that I didn't really say that much about why feathers aren't cinematic in my last couple of videos, I never actually said that feathers on the pyroraptor was the problem. I did point out that it seemed pretty unrealistic that the pyroraptor should be able to swim around in ice-cold waters at such incredible speeds as though it were a penguin, even though those feathers don't really look hydrodynamic to me. But I never said that feathers on the pyroraptor were the problem. I was discussing feathers regarding the OG dinosaurs of the Jurassic series, in particular the Tyrannosaurus rex and the velociraptor. I've already spoken at length about how I consider all the Jurassic Park dinosaurs really to be sort of their own thing, where they were designed so specifically for this movie that even if they used real-world science to inform those designs, the designs themselves and the portrayals of those dinosaurs as we see them have basically transcended any of that stuff to become their own thing. They are their own particular brand of cinematic dinosaur, but I've already spoken about that. The question then becomes, why not add feathers to them? Even taking into account that they are classic designs that don't technically need altering, why do I think it's more cinematic to depict them as purely reptilian creatures as opposed to feathered creatures? Well, I do have my reasons, and in fact they are pretty universally recognized reasons. You see, to the human mind, reptiles evoke a very particular reaction. For whatever reason, scholars have debated it for centuries, but reptiles make us feel a very particular way. Usually, and I say usually, not always, but usually, it's a feeling of repulsion because there's something about a reptile that is alien. Not extraterrestrial, but otherly. When you look at, say, another mammal, another mammalian species like something feline, something canine or something, we as humans, who are also mammals, can recognize certain things in their features that feel familiar. They may not be an exact match for a human feature, but we can see something that's at least kind of recognizable. They have eyes with round pupils, they have hair, they have soft skin, things like that. But when you look at a reptile, they have features like eyes and skin and whatnot, but they're not as familiar. A reptile's eyes have slits for pupils. Their skin is hard and thick and bumpy and rough. They don't have any hair at all. And depending on the variety, they can get even weirder than that. Some varieties of reptile don't have legs. Some varieties of reptile don't have lips and just have their teeth jutting out of their mouths and they're bared all the time. Some reptiles are armed with sharp razors running down their bodies. There is something about a reptile that falls right into that sweet spot where it's not necessarily as instantly freaky as something insectoid or arachnoid, but it's definitely not in the realm of the familiar. It's something that puts us off a little. And again, I say usually. There is the other side of that where people look at reptilian creatures and think, wow, that looks really cool. I like the way that looks. But it's for the same reason. It's because they are unfamiliar, because they have that sort of alien quality to their appearance. Same thought process, it just arrives at a different conclusion. When you apply this idea to the realm of writing fiction, it's no wonder that there are so many reptilian monsters out there, oftentimes representing something that's not especially human. Something like the raw power of nature, or some divine godlike influence, or evil itself. It can be any sort of inhuman thing, but more often than not, we see that it manifests in a reptilian form all over the world. And again, it's been hotly debated as to why, and I'm not here to try telling you what the definitive answer to that is. I'm just saying that this is the case. So when you're looking to make a really effective inhuman monster, a monster that's really threatening and really disturbing, a reptilian monster can have that effect. And when it comes to dinosaurs, that's been applied very frequently. There's something about dinosaurs that it's like they're dragons, but they're real. That's a large part of what draws so many people to them in the first place. We're always told dragons aren't real. There aren't any real big reptiles that could fly or gobble you down in one bite. And then we go to a museum for the first time and we see the bones of these things that actually were like that. Maybe not exactly, but like they were dragons, but they were real. And we're like, cool, there is something to this. Again, I'm speaking in sort of general terms. I'm sure you've heard some variation of that before. But when we apply that to the movies, we do sometimes see that dinosaurs play the role that would normally be reserved for a dragon, thematically speaking. They represent the fury of nature or something like that. And a reptilian visage helps make them resonate, helps make them stick in our minds. Birds, on the other hand, and feathered creatures don't have that same visual effect. Not the same way a reptile does. Birds can be creepy in certain contexts. Like, you take a big black raven, you put him on a dead tree in front of a haunted house with lightning striking. That certainly helps add atmosphere, but even then, it's not really the raven that you're afraid of. It's the haunted house that you're approaching because you're about to go inside and there are going to be ghosts in there. And that is the terrifying thing. The raven is just gravy for all intents and purposes. But with most birds, though, even though they don't necessarily have human features of their own, they still have the advantage that most of them are associated with things like beauty and hope. There's all sorts of imagery you can think of in that regard. The red-breasted robin is the first sign that spring has come. A dove is a symbol of peace. Peacock feathers are considered highly beautiful. Women's fashion, a lot of the times when it's really high-end fashion, incorporates bird feathers or things that are meant to look like feathers. That's not going to get the same sort of reaction. I'm sorry, it's just not. There's only ever really been one movie in the entire history of cinema that used birds as the primary monster so effectively, and that was The Birds by Alfred Hitchcock. At least as far as I know. The only other movies I can think of that try to use birds as monsters are things like The Giant Claw or Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, where Okondoru shows up. They were not necessarily that frightening, and the only reason the Hitchcock movie was frightening is because Hitchcock really put a lot of effort into making those things frightening. On their own, they're all familiar species of birds in that movie. We don't get scared by them just automatically, not the same way we would if they were snakes or crocodiles or something like that. So when you start applying feathers to a dinosaur, the feather part isn't going to register the same way. Look at the pyroraptors again. Remember how I mentioned that the scientifically accurate pyroraptor looks more like a bird, but in the movie it still has those prominent reptilian features, especially in the face? Same thing. It maintained the reptilian features even with the feathers because that's the part that's going to get the reaction. The desired idea of this is a dangerous, unfamiliar, otherly kind of creature coming towards me. That would be the primary reason. And when we see the feathered dinosaurs in the flashbacks to Jurassic World Dominion, you know, the prologue scene that I already alluded to, there is a T-Rex with downy feathers, and there's a velociraptor with downy feathers that I'll bring up again in a moment, but they do have a very different vibe to them. It's just not the same seeing a T-Rex that looks fuzzy as it is seeing a T-Rex that looks scaly. I mean, even though it's the same model, it still has a very different vibe to it. And as for the velociraptor, you know, I've actually had a couple of epiphanies about the velociraptor that I'd like to discuss. That was actually part of why I took so long to make this video. Part of it was because this is debuting after Mother's Day weekend. I had some priorities. But I had some other realizations about the velociraptor that I think need to be brought up. Let's start by addressing the sauropod in the room. A lot of people have said they wanted the velociraptor designs in Jurassic Park updated to have feathers, but that's always where the conversation stops, at least as far as I've ever seen. They want feathers added to it because that's scientifically accurate. But the thing is, if you want a scientifically accurate velociraptor, you got to do more than just put feathers on it. You've also got to shrink it down and make it a lot less intelligent. Because real velociraptors, in addition to having feathers on their bodies, only came up to the average person's kneecap, and there's no evidence to suggest they were any brighter than your average bird or reptile. That's a true velociraptor for you right there. And you have to admit that in terms of being cinematic, that's not going to cut it as your movie's main antagonist. It's not like what that one kid at the beginning of Jurassic Park said. We're not talking about a 6-foot turkey here. We're talking about a turkey-sized turkey. A creature that is small and not very bright, and for all intents and purposes does look like a chicken. So what's going to really be intimidating about that? They're not intimidating on their own. One of them charges at you, kick it. It'll run away. A whole group of them is coming towards you, grab a stick, swing it around, start making loud noises. They'll keep their distance. At least, presumably. Again, we have no actual living velociraptors to base this on, but if being big and intimidating and making a loud noise can scare away a bear, which you can find plenty of videos of online, presumably it'll work on a velociraptor, which is significantly smaller. So if you're really looking for scientific accuracy, just taking the basic design of the velociraptor and slapping feathers on it is not enough. You've got to do more. You want scientific accuracy, you got to go all the way, which the Dominion prologue, again, did do. And again, we can see that this is a very different creature. If you didn't actually have much knowledge about dinosaurs beyond what you see in the movies, you might not even recognize what this thing is. You might not realize it is meant to be a velociraptor, but it is. And I'm sure you can tell why that wouldn't have the same effect as a creature that is just as tall or taller than your average man, who can look you square in the eye, you can tell it's thinking, and it has that strange, scaly, otherworldly look to it, that unfamiliar reptilian visage that always gets a reaction out of people. And I can anticipate at least one potential counter-argument to this, where I'm saying the raptors wouldn't be nearly as intimidating because of their size and their lower intelligence, yet we have the Compsognathus swarm in the Lost World Jurassic Park. Well, that comparison isn't necessarily going to cut it, because the Compies are framed in a completely different way from the raptors. When the Compies first show up in the very beginning of the Lost World, they're depicted as pigeons that just happen to have a razor bite. They're not actively dangerous. They don't want to harm the little girl who comes across them. She actually thinks it's kind of cute that there's this weird little lizard thing that wants to eat her food. It's just that she doesn't really know how to properly handle a wild animal, and you shouldn't really get that close to a wild animal anyway, and as a result, they wind up going a little nuts and hurting her. But they don't even hurt her that bad. Considering how quickly her injuries are hand-waved away later on, we have to assume that all the worst she got was just a couple of bites. We don't actually see it, but it couldn't really be that horrible. And later on when they show up, and they take down that one hunter, I believe his name is Dieter Stark, they're not framed as the villains in that scene. The compies in that scene are the underdogs who are taking down the actual villain, which is the sadistic hunter who is going after creatures just because he's cruel and torturing them because he's a sadist. And they're sort of enacting a retribution of sorts on him because of that. They're not the villains. The raptors are supposed to be the villains. And the raptors, if they're going to be effective villains, they've got to have certain qualities. You're not going to have an easy time making an effective villain out of something that's small. People have tried, certainly, but it's not easy. You'll have a far easier time convincing somebody that something is intimidating and villainous if that thing or that person is big. Not necessarily huge, but certainly big enough to make even a tall person think, I don't want to tangle with that. And that was done with the Jurassic Park velociraptors. But it's not the only thing, and this is the biggest epiphany of all that I had. I'm curious to see how people will respond to this one. As I was brainstorming how to approach this video, and even if I should make a video at all, I realized something. The first fictional, made-up hybrid dinosaur species to debut in this series was not the Indominus Rex, nor was it any of those creatures that appeared in the weird Chaos Effect toy line. No, the first fictional hybrid dinosaur of the Jurassic Park series is the velociraptor. Plain and simple. It's not a made-up hybrid in context of the film. In universe, that is meant to be a literal velociraptor. But in concept, in terms of how it exists within our world, and as viewing it as a creature in a movie, it's a fictional species. It's not an actual velociraptor as established, but it's not even an exaggerated velociraptor. It's a bunch of different traits from other dinosaurs put together in what is essentially a fictional species. The size of the creature was more inspired by the Deinonychus, but even then it was exaggerated because the Deinonychus was not as tall as a human being either. And no, the velociraptors were not based on the Utah raptors because the Utah raptors were not discovered until the movie was well into production. It was quite a lucky coincidence that that happened because then they could go backwards and essentially claim, look, we actually did manage to get it right purely by chance, even though you could say the Utah raptor is perhaps a little too big to have inspired the velociraptor. But anyway, size derived from other dromaeosaurids. The intelligence, meanwhile, was taken from the Troodon, a creature which was observed to have a very large brain case in terms of dinosaur species, and thus paleontologists speculated that as dinosaurs go, it must have been especially intelligent. Some even went so far as to suggest that had the Troodon not gone extinct, it might have kept evolving until it became its own kind of humanoid creature, which led to the creation of this nightmare. Yeah, you remember what I was saying earlier about reptilian features having an alien appearance? This is the extreme logical conclusion of that train of thought. Anyway, though, intelligence was taken from the Troodon, and the name was essentially taken from a creature that was known to science at the time, but wasn't really a mainstream creature. So, much like the Dilophosaurus, which also wasn't mainstream, it was thought that maybe they could take a bit more liberties with it. Even the region is wrong. Alan Grant and Ellie Sattler are excavating one of these 6-foot-tall hyper-intelligent velociraptors in the western United States at the beginning of Jurassic Park, even though velociraptors are native to Asia. So since it incorporates so many features from other dinosaurs, and even adds a few of its own that weren't necessarily connected to any known species at the time, velociraptors in Jurassic Park are, for all intents and purposes, a made-up species. This right here is a fictional dinosaur. It doesn't exist. There is no real-world equivalent for it. And we're talking about applying real-world science to that? Why? The best you can hope for in that kind of scenario is like when you try applying scientific principles to vampires. You have to essentially look at the traits the vampires have and then work backwards to try and find some sort of biological reason for it. That's what we're essentially doing here. Granted, the velociraptors aren't supernatural, but they're still fictional. They still have traits that, when put all together, make for a creature that is not real. So I don't really see the point in making them scientifically accurate when they never have been. And that includes just slapping feathers on them. If we slap feathers on them, it's still a made-up species. Now it's just a made-up species with feathers, and we've taken away that iconic look that made them so effective in the first place. And let us not forget that this dinosaur, which does not exist, originated in that first movie, which was based on the first book, both of which were hailed for their adherence to scientific accuracy. You know, I'm starting to think that maybe people give the original Jurassic Park a bit too much credit in that regard. Like, the tales about how scientifically accurate Jurassic Park was when it first debuted is kind of like a folktale where maybe it was based on something that actually happened, but with each retelling it gets more and more embellished until it suddenly bears no resemblance to what actually started it in the first place. Is Jurassic Park scientifically accurate when compared to something like Dinosaurs or 1 million years BC? Sure it is. But that's like saying Batman is a more realistic hero than Superman. It still leaves a very wide margin for error. And if you were to compile all of the liberties taken and concessions made and plot holes ignored and all this other stuff that is unrealistic and not feasible and not plausible, you'd find that those realistic portions that get so boosted, they don't actually comprise that much of the final product. They are there, certainly, but they're not that prominent. There are still a lot of things that are inaccurate. Back in the 90s, all that stuff was forgiven. Why it's not being forgiven now and why people are being a bit more strict when it comes to how the dinosaurs are portrayed or how they think they should be portrayed, search me, I don't know what the reason is. One individual in the comments of the last video posed an interesting question. In light of all this discussion about what place scientific accuracy has when depicting dinosaurs in fiction, he asked, how many liberties can we feasibly take before the dinosaur is no longer recognizable as a dinosaur? Like I said, it is an interesting question. Based on the available evidence, though, I would say that if there is a limit, we haven't found it yet. After all, we can have made-up species of dinosaurs. We can have dinosaurs that fill the roles of dragons. We can have dragons that fill the roles of dinosaurs. We have dinosaurs that breathe fire. We have dragons that are filtered through science. This is all in fiction, of course, but I can't tell you where the line is drawn. I can't tell you exactly what separates a fictional dinosaur from a fictional dragon. All I can tell you is that I know the difference when I see it. And that's about all I can say on that matter. In fact, I think that's all I can really say on this whole matter. So this, like I said, is the last video on this particular subject. And I hope I've made the point I'm trying to make as clear as I possibly can. You don't necessarily have to agree with me, but at the same time, I still don't understand why we're having this discussion about making a velociraptor more accurate by putting feathers on it when the velociraptor in question never existed in the first place. And I'd also like to say one last thing that may have gotten lost in this whole discussion. When it comes to Jurassic World Dominion, I did take the initial stance of taking the movie's side to a certain degree because people were talking about all the scientific inaccuracies and stuff that didn't make sense and everything, and I was simply taking the approach of not only is it for the sake of being cinematic, but also the fact that We don't necessarily know the context based on the trailer. All these clips are out of context. So that was my initial approach, and I stand by it. But I do still want to acknowledge that Jurassic World Dominion could still be a bad movie. Even after we lower the bar for expectation by acknowledging that it's probably not going to equal or surpass that first movie, at this point I'm not sure anything really can, but even after doing that, there's still a possibility, not necessarily a strong probability, but definitely a possibility that Dominion can still be a bad movie in its own right. But if it is a bad movie, it will be because of things like bland character development, or a nonsensical plot, or themes that don't jive with what's being presented, or any of the other stuff that generally makes or breaks the quality of a film, regardless of whether or not it has dinosaurs in it. It won't be because the dinosaurs are scientifically inaccurate. In fact, there is a chance all the same that even if the movie is bad, the dinosaurs might still deliver anyway. But we don't know. I have seen exactly as much of Jurassic World Dominion as any of you, unless of course one of you out there actually worked on the movie. But at this point we don't know. All I know is that when it comes to depicting the dinosaurs of Jurassic Park and Jurassic World as scientifically accurate, you can try, certainly, you can take science into account, but at the end of the day, being cinematic will still win out. And hey, you might even have to make up a dinosaur species in order to make it work. And like I said, that's all I got for this particular round. Now, finally, I will move on to the other stuff. For real this time. Until such time as that ever happens, this is the Omni viewer signing off.
Congratulations, you reached the end. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to consider supporting us on Patreon. Of course, the other way to support us is to go to Amazon and check out our books: Operation Red Dragon, The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, The Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Also check the description for links to DeviantArt and other platforms we operate. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.